Well, in just the past hour, the final debate has got underway over whether to impeach the President of the United States. Democrats and Republicans in the House of Representatives are making their case about whether Donald Trump violated the Constitution. He's accused of withholding aid to Ukraine to pressure it into investigating his political rival. The Democrat-controlled House is expected to make Trump the third president to be impeached in U.S. history, while Trump has just called the process on social media an assault on America. Well, Democratic Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, opened that debate, calling for both sides to put aside their partisanship and vote in the interest of the country.
It is tragic that the president's reckless actions make impeachment necessary. He gave us no choice. What we are discussing today is the established fact that the president violated the Constitution. It is a matter of fact that the president is an ongoing threat to our national security and the integrity of our elections, the basis of our democracy. Hundreds of historians, legal scholars, and former prosecutors, regardless of party, have stated that the president committed impeachable offenses.
While Trump's Republican allies say that the Democrats have been trying to impeach the president since he was elected.
We on the Republican side have no problem taking our case to the majority and to the people of this country because they elected Donald Trump, and it is a matter for the voters, not this House, not in this way, not in the way this is being done. It has trampled everything this House believes in. I said it yesterday, and I believe it to be this true today. I will fight this on process, which has been deplorable, to use a word of the majority. It has been awful. The calendar and the clock make it impressive that we actually do it quickly. We don't care about rules. We don't care about minority hearing days. We don't care about giving the opportunity for witnesses to be called because the chairman gets to determine what is relevant.
Well, in a moment, we'll speak to our White House correspondent, Kimberly Halkett. But first, let's go to Heidi Jo Castro, who's on Capitol Hill, where that vote will happen. Heidi, we've been seeing these really impassioned speeches on the Hill today. Talk us through what we've been hearing from both sides.
Sure. So we're only about 1 hour into the 6 hours established rules for the debate, and it's been very contentious and, of course, partisan. You heard from Nancy Pelosi, who opened these debates, saying that the president's reckless actions gave Congress no choice but to proceed down this impeachment. And she said that the founding fathers of the country envisioned a republic that would not be under threat as it is from what she says as the ongoing national security risk that Trump's actions poses. Now, by the end of this evening, we do expect this historic vote to take place, and it's not a question of whether or not Trump will be impeached. Democrats, who hold the majority in the House of Representatives, certainly have the numbers to pass these articles of impeachment. What we're looking at is how many Democrats might defect from their party caucus. We know of at least one or two who have said that they will not vote to impeach Trump, but there are no Republicans who have said that they will. So we expect this to go down very narrowly partisan lines. And particularly, we're looking at some of these Democrats who represent districts that are conservative, that actually voted for Trump in the last presidential election. And a handful of them have said that they've come off of the fence on this impeachment question, and they have decided to vote to approve the impeachment. Explaining the reasons, they said it's because they feel compelled to uphold their constitutional duty to oversee the president. And they do this knowing full well that they may pay the political price with their constituents in their conservative districts.
Heidi Jo Castro there live for us on Capitol Hill. We'll be talking to Heidi a lot more today. Thank you, Heidi, for now. Well, let's now also go to Kimberly Halkett, who's our White House correspondent. Kimberly, you're outside the White House, and I imagine the president is watching pretty closely inside. I see that he's just tweeted in the last few minutes, all in caps, "Such atrocious lies by the radical left, do-nothing Democrats. This is an assault on America and an assault on the Republican Party." So no surprises there, right, Kimberly?
Well, there's no surprise, I guess, that the president is defending himself in the strongest and most passionate of terms, given the fact that the president put forward a 6-page letter on the eve of this vote, making some of the very same points. One of the other points that the White House press secretary has made in just the last hour is we can confirm the president is watching these proceedings, we are told. Stephanie Gresham telling reporters that he is doing that in between the meetings that he is conducting. And that tweet that you just read a moment ago, certainly indicative of how the president is reacting. Now, in the midst of all of this, the president has also retweeted one of his own tweets from earlier in the day, where he said, "I did nothing wrong. This should never happen to another president again. Say a prayer." Certainly, the president maintains and has been making the argument repeatedly that this is a partisan coup, a line that is very clear in his 6-page letter to the House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, one that she responded calling sick. This is a back and forth that has been taking place, and the arguments being made by this president, whether on Twitter, whether in his letter, or whether by his defenders in the House of Representatives, is that it is motivated to try and undo the results of the 2016 U.S. election, one that ultimately, if and when the president is impeached, and we believe that will happen later today, that the voters will have the opportunity to weigh in on come November 2020.
Kimberly, I see that the president has cleared his schedule for most of the day, but then he's headed for the seemingly aptly named Battle Creek for a rally later?
Battle Creek, Michigan. Yeah, Battle Creek is very fitting, you're right, and so is the state that he's going to, given the fact that this is one of the swing states that helped decide the election back in 2016. And also notable is the fact that when we look at the poll numbers, while the nation is divided in terms of whether or not to impeach Donald Trump, what we notice is that in these key battleground states, Michigan being one of them, Wisconsin is another, and the third one escapes me at the moment. But the point is that in those states, support for the U.S. president is actually rising. There's pushback on what many people are starting to call impeachment fatigue, if you will. And this campaign is certainly seizing on that. Donald Trump will be leaving the White House later today. He'll be going to Battle Creek. And what we're setting up possibly is a very interesting split screen moment that really sums up where America is right now, because simultaneously as we see this vote potentially coming down, on the other side of Americans' TV screens will be the hundreds, even thousands of supporters who back the president and are opposed to his impeachment.
Kimberly Halkett there, our White House correspondent. Thank you, Kimberly. Well, we'll leave it there for now and speak to Clyde Wilcox, who's a professor of government at Georgetown University here in Doha. Clyde, just picking up on something that Kimberly was talking about there. She was talking about impeachment fatigue. Is there impeachment fatigue already? I mean, we're just starting potentially a very long Senate trial in January. How is the public perceiving this whole process? Do they even want to see a trial go forward?
You know, the public is not paying a lot of attention because the details are complicated and too obscure for the public to pay much attention to. Trump supporters are buying his line that he did nothing wrong. But, you know, imagine a different world where Donald Trump was a different man, where he could say, I did something wrong here, where he could be like Bill Clinton and say, you know, as I had this phone call, it seemed right, but now that I look at it, it was over the line. And then we didn't have Republicans saying he did nothing wrong. You know, there's no Republican in Congress who really thinks he did nothing wrong here, right? In that kind of world, it wouldn't be so divisive, it wouldn't be so partisan, but Donald Trump is never going to be that man. He's going to go there and say they're trying to have a coup, which of course is not what's going on.
Do you think that we might see him actually testify in the Senate trial?
Donald Trump couldn't go 2 minutes without perjuring himself.
Well, setting that aside, is there the room for any senators potentially to defect? I know everything's been so partisan in the House, and you know we've seen only one Republican House representative, well, desert his party and become an independent in order to be able to vote differently on the impeachment. What are we likely to see in the Senate?
You know, it's really hard to say, but privately, a lot of Republican senators are voicing deep concern about this activity and about other kinds of activity that's been going on in other countries. Someone mentioned earlier, what could Bolton say? Well, Bolton has been saying privately in Washington that Trump was pursuing business interests with Turkey as part of the deal to withdraw troops out of Syria. So if he said that publicly, that would be a pretty big deal, right? So if we will not have a secret ballot, I agree on that, but if they did, many people would defect. Does anyone have the courage to actually vote that way? I don't know. Maybe Mitt Romney, maybe Susan Collins, I don't know.
Well, the Democrats are making this a real constitutional issue. I mean, Nancy Pelosi was incredibly reluctant to begin this process in the first place. What's the political calculus now for Republican senators? Because there are some moderate Republicans, some vulnerable Republican senators who will have to take that into account going into an election.
Yeah. So if you're thinking just politically, right, only can I be reelected, then the core of the Republican base is really supportive of Donald Trump. People who don't support Donald Trump have left the party, they're independents, they've become Democrats. So you would be really angering a core of the voters you absolutely need. So that would be a really tough vote to take. But, you know, you're supposed to be an impartial juror, so.
Well, let me ask you about this. There's one particular gentleman, I believe, who's had a meeting with Donald Trump last week and has decided to defect from the Democratic Party. Well, to potentially, well, and a number of his staff, I believe, have also said that they will no longer work for him. So is there the potential to go the other way in the Senate as well, that Democratic senators might leave? Yeah,
you could imagine maybe Joe Manchin from West Virginia voting against the conviction. In the case of the House member from New Jersey, he was never going to win his Democratic primary, so this is a pretty easy call for him. Let me pick up on one thing that we were talking about before the break, and that is there are no crimes here. One of the things that occurs to me is that it's very surprising that the Democrats didn't rely on the second half of the Mueller report, which details at least
there was a huge amount of debate about whether or not that would be a third article.
Right, and there were 10 cases where he talked about criminal obstruction of justice. I thought 9 of them were pretty convincing. You could have picked a few of those. I'm really surprised they've kept it so narrow.
But it has become very divisive for the Democratic Party, and so this is potentially them playing it safe then?
I think it would have been safer to have gone more broadly myself.
Clyde Wilcox, a professor at Georgetown University here in Doha. We'll come back to you in a moment. Right now, I want to take you to live pictures of Capitol Hill. You're watching special coverage here on Al Jazeera because the final debate has now gotten underway over whether or not to impeach the President of the United States. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, in her opening remarks, said that Trump, by violating the Constitution, gave lawmakers no choice but to pursue impeachment. Trump is facing charges of abusing his power and obstructing Congress. That impeachment vote is expected in the coming hours. Well, Patty Culhane is in Washington, D.C. for us to talk more about the impeachment with a very special panel. Patty, over to you.
Thanks. Welcome to Washington. It can't be overstated, understated. This is a historic day. Just the third president facing the possibility of being impeached by the U.S. House of Representatives. I have a great panel joining us to talk about this historic vote. John Malcolm, he's the vice president of the Institute for Constitutional Government at the Heritage Foundation. That's a conservative think tank here in Washington. Robinson Woodward Burns, he's an assistant professor at Howard University, specializing in the Constitution. And Melanie Sloan, a former federal prosecutor and founding director of Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Government. John, I want to start with you. Thank you all for joining us.
Sure. Pleasure.
John, you don't think that he should be impeached. Why?
No, for a variety of reasons. In addition to the fact that I don't think that the facts warrant impeachment, this has certainly been done in a very partisan manner. I mean, Jerry Nadler back in 1998 said the following. He said,
Jerry Nadler, for our audience who doesn't know.
Yeah, well, he's the chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, and he said back in 1998 at the time of the Clinton impeachment hearing, quote, "There must never be a narrowly voted impeachment. When impeachment is supported by one of our major political parties and opposed by the other, such an impeachment will produce divisiveness and bitterness in our politics for years to come and will call into question the very legitimacy of our political institutions." Well, at the end of the day today, there is going to be a very partisan vote. I don't think you are going to get any Republicans voting in favor of impeachment, and you're going to probably get 1 or 2 Democrats crossing over, in fact, and voting with the Republicans.
Here's the thing that's been really troubling for me. Being in Washington, there are 2 sets of facts, right? Yeah. And we're going to spend 6 hours in the House, Republicans saying these are the facts, Democrats saying these are the facts. Facts are actually facts.
That's true.
Do you believe that it is true that the president told the president of Ukraine that basically he could have that there was a quid pro quo? Do you believe there was?
No. Facts are facts, but how one interprets those facts is subject to reasonable differences. And I have believed since the very beginning here that if you went into these hearings believing that the president was clearly undermining the national interests of the United States and he was doing so for a purely personal, partisan reason to gain an advantage over a political rival, then that is what you believed and your views have been strengthened.
If that's true?
If that were true, that would arguably constitute a gross abuse of office, which would be an impeachable offense. But the facts do not support that.
But we've had his own ambassador to the European Union say there was a quid pro quo when it came to the White House visit. Everybody was in on it. Everybody knew about it. And not a transcript, but a detail from the White House saying, in the call, you want to buy these missiles? OK, can you do us a favor, though?
The president and not career diplomats within the State Department gets to determine what foreign policy is. The president stated that he had 3 reasons why he was skeptical of Ukraine. One, he has said on numerous occasions that he believes that the United States provides too much foreign aid to other countries in general.
OK, he didn't do this with Ukraine until Joe Biden said he was running for president.
Well, first of all, even if that were true, and I'm not sure that is true, the president said that he had 2 concerns about Ukraine, which were presented as false narratives by career diplomats. One is that he was concerned about potential Ukrainian interference in the 2016 election. And 2, he was concerned about whether or not the Ukrainians had truly turned over a new leaf about investigating corruption within that country. And that includes Burisma, and that includes Joe Biden, who was, at the time, the vice president of the United States during the Obama administration. And if there is a factual predicate that would support that investigation, and I believe there was, the president is fully within his power to ask a foreign government to assist with an investigation into corruption.
Melanie, are there 2 sets of facts here?
There aren't 2 sets of facts. There's only one set of facts, and that is that the president asked that that U.S. aid be held up until Zelensky announced an investigation of Hunter Biden. He didn't even care if there was an actual investigation. He just wanted them to announce one. And I don't think that the Republicans are very much focused on the facts. The facts really aren't helping them here, which is why they keep talking about the process. They go over and over that this is an unfair process. Again, also leaving out that part of the reason that it is quick and that there has been less testimony is because the administration is stonewalling Congress, has refused to put people before, has refused to hand over any documents, and has not allowed its top officials to testify.
But Melanie, you're a former federal prosecutor. There is an argument that the Democrats could have waited for the courts to weigh in. They already have, at least in the case of Don McGahn, and said there is no blanket executive privilege. These people have to go before Congress. This is a legitimate subpoena. Why not wait? Isn't that pretty much just about the politics of the election?
I think there's no question that they could have waited and they could have gone to court, but that would have taken an exceedingly long time. And they were, as Nancy Pelosi has said, very worried about the integrity of the American electoral system and what's going to happen in the 2020 election. And they didn't feel like they could any longer wait while Republicans just tried to stymie and stonewall any investigation.
Robinson, one of the things that I think is an interesting point that Republicans keep making is that this is going to set a precedent, that we are going to enter a time where every president gets impeached. Is that a legitimate concern?
The Constitution gives the House broad leeway to understand what sort of impeachable offenses a president may or may not have committed, and the Senate, of course, has the authority to try those. It is intentionally left to the legislature to determine the process. Now, we do have an increasingly polarized partisan scene in which it is possible that this could happen again, but it is consistent with the constitutional structure we have to allow Congress to determine whether an offense is impeachable or not.
Let's look ahead, because I think everybody knows what's going to happen. The House is going to vote to impeach Donald Trump, the only 3rd president to actually have that put next to his name in the history books for all eternity. But the Senate, that's the wild card here. They have to take an oath that they will be impartial. But we've already seen the Senate Mitch McConnell come out and say, yeah, we're not going to have witnesses. We're not going to be impartial. He's not going to be impeached. How do you square that John, as a constitutional expert and knowing what the precedent is and where we're supposed to be with where we're going to be.
Sure. First of all, by the way, I'm also a former federal prosecutor. And at some point, I would like to address something that Melanie just said. But I'll go directly to your question, which is the Constitution gives the House of Representatives the sole power to impeach, and it gives the Senate the sole power to try impeachments. There have already been a ton of witnesses who have been called. The House has been able to call, or they were impatient and not waiting until the courts had ruled, all of the witnesses whom they wish to call.
That's
it
not
is up
true.
to them.
They called 12, and the subpoenas were rejected by the White House.
First of all, they subpoenaed John Bolton, and when John Bolton went to court, they withdrew the subpoena. In addition to that, they had actually been winning at the lower level of the federal courts, but in their rush to get this done, they are not prepared to let.
You can't legitimately say that they were allowed to testify. Mick Mulvaney, the acting chief of staff of the president, everyone who would have firsthand knowledge was not allowed to talk.
So I'll give you another quote. This comes from an Office of Legal Counsel opinion from the Department of Justice issued by the Holder Justice Department. July 15, 2014, the executive branch's longstanding position, reaffirmed by numerous administrations of both political parties, is that the president's immediate advisors are absolutely immune from congressional testimonial process. This immunity is rooted in constitutional separation of powers and the immunity of the president himself from congressional compulsion to testify. If the House Democrats wanted to push that in court, which they have done for Mulvaney, they could do that for Bolton. They could do that for any number of these witnesses. But to all of a sudden say abuse of Congress. I mean, if we are now going to be impeaching presidents who assert an executive privilege in response to a congressional subpoena, then every president from now until the end of time will end up being impeached. Because if that's an impeachable offense, every president has done that.
Was that from Fast and Furious? The courts overruled that.
Well, what I'm also curious about here is that the refusal to turn over any documents, and that is not, in fact, within their power.
Executive privilege is executive privilege. If the executive branch demanded these documents from Congress, Congress would be screaming that they don't have to turn over these documents.
We just had a ruling from a federal judge who said there is no blanket executive privilege.
From a federal district court judge. That has now been
still a judge.
Yes, and you have an appeal process, and the president has availed himself of an appeal, and rather than wait until that appeal process works its way out and then letting the process play out, the Democrats have instead said, no, we're going to claim that we were absolutely entitled to this, that any privilege that the president has asserted is a bunch of bunk, and we're going to impeach him for it. That is outlandish in the extreme. Now, the answer to the question that you asked, which is, it is up to the House to bring charges. They can bring those charges however they want to bring charges. It is not up to the Senate to make up for deficiencies that occurred in the investigation process in the House of Representatives. And the Senate will decide, after horse trading, I assume, the precise parameters of what that trial will look like.
Melanie, I'm going to let you weigh in on this, but first, Robinson, you're the constitutional expert here. Is there supposed to be a trial in the Senate? And this excuse that we keep hearing from Republicans is the House had their shot, they didn't get it, we're not responsible for actually finding evidence. What does the Constitution say? Are they responsible for having a trial?
They are. The Constitution gives fairly broad leeway for the House and Senate to interpret their duties. The actual impeachment clauses are fairly brief, and one of the ways we can understand the process is through Federalist Paper 65, in which Hamilton describes it as a political process. And that doesn't mean a partisan one, but a legislative one. This is the way that the House and Senate can check an executive if the executive oversteps. It's part of the separation of powers systems we use. Now, that separation of powers requires that both chambers are able to broadly interpret how these processes work, and the Senate will likely draw on rules that came out of the Andrew Johnson impeachments of 1867 to 68, and probably follow that longstanding historical precedent in their trial.
What does that look like? Is there going to be an actual trial? If they were to go back to the 1800s?
The trial works a bit differently from what we might think of as a conventional trial. Members of the House are those who explain the charges against the president, and senators act as an impartial jury. It requires a 2/3 majority to remove the president. So it's a bit different from a trial the way we think of it, but it is a clearly explained process, at least through the precedent we have.
Okay, so Melanie, do you think that there's going to be a trial? Do you want to respond to his argument that the president's been transparent and he has executive privilege?
The president clearly hasn't been transparent at all. As I said, they've been stonewalling the investigation, refusing to turn over documents. There have been interest groups that have been able to go to court and get documents from the administration through the Freedom of Information Act litigation that the State Department, for example, has refused to turn over to Congress themselves. You have to look at this more like the House was, if we put it in more common parlance, like the grand jury. And you get witnesses before the grand jury, and then you bring the matter over to the Senate for actually a full-blown trial. So this idea that because the House already called anybody that they should, there be no additional witnesses in the Senate is actually kind of crazy. If we looked at our regular criminal justice system, there are witnesses brought before a grand jury, and then when you have a trial, there are witnesses brought at trial. The reason that we're not going to have witnesses at trial is because Senator Mitch McConnell, the majority leader, doesn't want any. He doesn't want there to be this spectacle in the Senate. He knows it will hurt the Republican Party. He knows that if Mick Mulvaney and John Bolton come and testify truthfully about what they knew about this whole matter, it will go very badly for the president. And Mitch McConnell has already, as Mr. Malcolm has said, has pre-baked the outcome. And they want this to be over as quickly as possible. And they don't want any more bad facts for the president.
But here's, I think, what's getting lost in the American media. Mitch McConnell doesn't have the final say. There are 4 Senate Republicans that are retiring. They don't have to worry about being primaried. There are other senators. All it takes is 4 Republican senators to vote with the Democrats and say, no, we want to hear from John Bolton, who has sent a lot of signals that he's ready to basically burn the House down. So what's the likelihood 4 Republicans say, nope, we're going to have a trial? First, you.
Well, first of all, again, the Senate gets to define the parameters of that trial. This is not like a standard criminal trial. During the Clinton impeachment proceedings, the trial, there were no live witnesses. There were excerpts of videotaped depositions. I don't know at the end of the day whether there will be live witnesses called. There had been a whole bunch of people who testified on camera in front of the House Intelligence Committee and deposition transcripts.
None with
I understand.
knowledge.
Let me finish. I don't know whether John Bolton will testify. I don't know whether Mick Mulvaney will testify. And if they do, they are wild cards. Same thing with Hunter Biden. Same thing with the whistleblower. Same thing with Adam Schiff. These are all unknowns. Melanie is very confident that this will not go so well for the Republicans. I'm not as confident as she is that is so.
Really? You think John Bolton's going to come and say everything was...
I don't know what John Bolton is going to say.
3 days after the phone call?
I do not know what John Bolton is going to say. It's very clear that he left on bad terms, but he also is aware of the fact that he was the national security advisor, and the national security advisor advises the president, and it is up to the president to make those decisions. So I don't know what John Bolton will say if called to testify, and I don't know whether he will be called to testify. And if he is, it's a gamble on both sides.
Melanie, go ahead. You just look like you need to get in on this. Go ahead.
John Bolton, we have heard numerous people say that he said, he didn't want to be any part of that drug deal that Sonderland was cooking up. And he definitely had the view that what was happening was a problem. Fiona Hill has testified about that. And it is clear John Bolton is writing a book about this. He has made it clear that he has things to say and that they would indeed be damaging.
Oh, he does have things to say. In fact, he went with his attorney into court and said, I want the court to tell me. I'm having one side has given me a subpoena, another side has exerted executive privilege. You tell me what to say. At that point, the House Democrats said, never mind, and they withdrew their subpoena. Now they want to hear from him again. And I am sure that he will say some things that will be damaging to the president. He may also have a thing or two to say that would be damaging to the Democrats. And regardless of what it is, the president does indeed have a legitimate ability to be able to decide whether he had a jaundiced view of Ukraine. And at the end of the day, I would remind people, although I know Melanie will say that this was only because he had been uncovered, which I do not believe, that the president not only released the $391 million
after the
in military
came to,
and after the vice president and a bipartisan group of senators had come to meet him in the White House and had said there is strong support for Ukraine and we believe that President Zelensky is
and everybody
sincere.
Knew. And the whistleblower had come out, and everybody knew that this investigation was going to start. But we're going to have a chance to talk about this more as the day proceeds, because this House hearing is going to go on forever. So for now, from Washington, John, Malcolm Robinson, Woodward Burns, Melanie Sloan, thank you so much for joining us. We will argue again in just a couple of hours, hopefully respectfully and by teaching people a few things about what's going on. A lot to get to today. Again, a historic day. It's really just the beginning, and we'll have to see what happens in the Senate. That's where the real fireworks could happen. But for now, I'm going to toss it back to Doha.